In 1962, a young 20-year-old Jamaican man who strongly protested his innocence was sentenced to hang at Birmingham's Winson Green prison. His story will draw a lot of controversy in the years to come of his innocence and whether he was really guilty of the crime he was hung for, and how much his race played a part in what has been argued as an unsafe conviction. Known as the last man to hang in Birmingham, this is the story of 20-year-old Oswald Grey. When people arrived from the West Indies during the 1950s, it was far from what they expected. It wasn't the promised land they'd been led to believe. Initially, there was no accommodation available for them until the last hour, when negotiations were made to house some of them in air raid shelters. Many were skilled tradesmen and professionals, doctors, carpenters, mechanics, teachers, but they had to take whatever job they could get and were often paid less than their white co-workers. There was also the colour bar, with many houses to let, as well as jobs that advertised signs saying no blacks, until the Race Relations Act of 1965 put a stop to this. Many families were forced to cram together in slum houses or pay extortionate prices for private accommodation. The climate change from a sunny island to a cold country was also a culture shock, which many were unprepared for. And some said that they thought the British houses were factories because of the chimneys with smoke coming out of them. West Indians settled in major cities such as Birmingham, England, being one of those cities. No picture exists of him in public records, but it is believed he would have looked and dressed like his generation of those times. 20-year-old Oswald Grey, who was a baker from Bogwalk, Jamaica, was one of those who settled in Birmingham, coming from Jamaica. It's not known who he came to England with, but his father Felix Grey settled at number 12 Gordon Road in Lozells, whilst 20-year-old Oswald had a room in a shared accommodation on Cannon Hill Road, Birmingham. On 176 Lee Bank Road was Al Bates and Sons Newsagents, which 46-year-old Thomas Bates and his family ran, and he lived above the shop with his mother. On Saturday the 2nd of June 1962, Thomas Bates was sat in the back of his shop watching TV with his 79-year-old mother Louisa Bates, who was partially blind, and a friend, 79-year-old Sally Hodgkinson. Mr. Bates often did this until he heard the door ring, indicating that a customer had entered the shop, upon which Mr. Bates came from out of the back to serve them. On the day in question, at approximately 6:30 p.m, Thomas Bates had been sat watching TV in the back room when he heard a customer come in. Seconds later, his mother, who was sat at the back of the shop also watching TV, heard a loud bang and ran in to find her son collapsed on the floor. Due to Thomas Bates' previous medical history, his mother initially thought he'd had a heart attack and called an ambulance. But 46-year-old Thomas Bates had died en route to the hospital, and upon examination of the body, a bullet hole was discovered in his chest. Thomas Bates had not died from a heart attack or any medical condition as his mother had thought. Mr. Bates had been shot dead. Upon this discovery, police launched a murder inquiry, and upon searching the shop, it is claimed that an empty cash tin was found discarded on the floor, which made police suspect that a robbery had taken place but had gone horribly wrong. Police then set to work rounding up any witnesses, with the first person they found being a 10-year-old little girl called Anne Bradley, who had been sent to the shop by her father for a paper. Anne Bradley told police that she saw a man in dark-coloured clothing, a black suit who stood outside the shop reading the postcard advertisements. He then entered the shop. Another witness, Miss Margaret Jean Brownlee, a nursery nurse from Audley Road, South Yardley, said that she'd been waiting at the bus stop outside the shop when she heard the sound of what she thought was a car backfiring. When she looked towards the shop, she said that she saw a man leaving the shop. He turned and ran down the road towards Bristol Road. She described the man that she saw earlier as a very dirty white man, or a pale coloured man with long straight hair and a sallow complexion. With the bus stop being so close to the shop, it was speculated that the perpetrator had escaped by getting onto the bus, and so police began boarding all the number 8 buses that ran along the road to question the driver and passengers. It has been alleged that a detective brought a prostitute forward by the name of Cecilia Gibbs, who claimed to have seen a black man loitering around the shops, to investigating detective Chief Superintendent Gerard Bomber. And going off of this tip from the prostitute, several raids and subsequent interviews were executed on the houses of black men around the city. In one of those raids, a then 19-year-old Oswald Grey was arrested and charged with stealing a gun and ammunition from a 60-year-old Balsall Heath man by the name of Hamilton Bacchus. It was decided that due to having a gun, he would be questioned about the murder of newsagent Thomas Bates, to which he replied, "I stole a gun, but I did not shoot anybody." At the time of his arrest, Oswald was found to be in possession of 10 bullet cartridges that were found in his pocket at the time of his arrest. After a search of his flat, a gun was said to have been found hidden under a wardrobe. Prior to his arrest, it was also alleged that police officers had been surveilling Oswald Grey and had caught him red-handed just as he was emptying ammunition into a dustbin outside his home, although, as crucial as this fact seemed, this was never mentioned in court. Police decided to conduct an identification parade on Oswald Grey, using Cecilia Gibbs, the so-called prostitute that had claimed to have seen a black man loitering around the shops, and she picked Oswald Grey out of the lineup. She said that she was sure it was him by the way he tilted his hat. It has also been alleged that the detective who had brought Cecilia forward as a witness then asked the chief superintendent for some payment for her, but was told that the police did not pay blood money. The detective was said to have been angry that no money was paid out to her. After the lineup, Oswald was arrested and charged with the murder of 46-year-old newsagent Thomas Bates, just 4 days after the murder. During questioning, it was alleged Oswald told police 4 different accounts of how he came to be in possession of the gun and what had happened to it before it was apparently found under a wardrobe. He initially told police that he'd spent the whole afternoon at a friend's home by the name of Errol Thomas, who was known by the street name of Hercules. He then retracted that statement and said he'd been at Pious Cafe in Balsall Heath on Mary Street, but the owners of the cafe, Mr. Cephas Smith and Miss Effie Dora Rose, denied seeing him that day. This was to be crucial because Oswald claimed that it was in this very cafe at around 3:30 p.m. on the day of question that he had given the gun to a man known as Mover, and that Mover had returned the gun to him that evening after 10 p.m. outside of a house in Burberry Street, Lozells, where Oswald had been attending a house party. Mover, whose real name was Harris Carnfee, denied that he had ever seen Oswald before or received any gun from him. Furthermore, Mover had an alibi, and Miss Valerie Dolores Kennedy claimed that Mover had been with her and her sister Barbara all day from 11 a.m. until around 10 p.m. and had not left her company all day. As part of his alibi, Oswald had told police that he had been with his father, Felix Grey, and a Miss Phyllis Shields at the time of the murder on Church Street, Lozells, having just left the pub. They'd been having a drink. The trial of Oswald Grey started on Monday the 8th of October 1962 at Birmingham Assizes Court. During the trial, 4 people claimed to have seen Oswald Grey loitering around the shop on the day of the murder. The prosecutor said that he was trying to build up the courage to commit the crime, and that he was committing the crime because he was desperate for money after being out of a job and on national assistance for a year. But what was noted in court by the defence was that all 4 witnesses gave different accounts of the clothes they said they saw Oswald wearing, and none of them were right. Margaret Jean Brownlee, the nursery nurse that was waiting at the bus stop outside the newsagents at the time of the murder, who initially thought that she heard the car backfiring, told the court that Oswald was not the man she saw running away from the shop. The 4 witnesses failed to pick Oswald out from an identity parade, but were suddenly able to identify him in court. And 4 other witnesses, said to be 4 women, testified that Oswald was not the man they saw at the shop that day. In fact, the only witness to definitely pick him was the prostitute who wanted paying. After a 4-day trial, on Friday the 12th of October 1962, it took the jury just 50 minutes of deliberating before finding 20-year-old Oswald Grey guilty of the murder of Thomas Bates, and the judge sentenced him to death with a date of Tuesday the 30th of October 1962, just over 2 weeks' time for him to be hung. Oswald appealed his sentence, insisting he was innocent, but his appeal was thrown out by the courts on the 29th of October 1962, the day before he was meant to hang, and a new date of November the 20th, 1962 was set for him to be hung. It was alleged that police had used what they called third-degree tactics in order to get a confession out of the then 19-year-old Oswald, but they do not go into specifics on what exactly these third-degree tactics were. There were also allegations by Oswald Grey of police racism, police bullying him into confessing to crimes he claimed he did not do, as well as allegations of police at the time leading the witnesses. A claim that had stereotypical and racial undertones, written by biographer Stuart McLaughlin, claims that Oswald Grey spent his last weeks in his cell oblivious to his fate, limbo dancing and hand jiving. Although reports of this ever happening never came from anyone serving at the prison at the time of Oswald's stay in prison, but the media ran with this narrative anyway. A barber at the prison where Oswald was held claimed that he cut Oswald's hair whilst he was in the prison, and whilst cutting his hair, he said that Oswald was crying constantly and kept on saying that he didn't do it. The barber, having spent time with him, believed that Oswald was innocent. On the 20th of November 1962, Oswald was scheduled to be hung at 8 a.m. The Jamaican inmates in the prison left their breakfasts outside of their cell doors uneaten in protest of the hanging of Oswald that was taking place that day. And 4 students from the local university stood outside the gates of Winson Green Prison with signs protesting the death penalty and hanging that would be taking place that day. 20-year-old Oswald Grey, weighing in at just 10 stones, was hung from a drop of nearly 8 foot, dislocating his 2nd and 3rd cervical vertebrae. All public records of Oswald Grey's trial have been sealed from the public until 2063, 101 years after he has been hung. The reason given for no access being granted is that any access to his records could be distressing for any remaining relatives of Oswald Grey.